Hey everyone, welcome to Disgorged Online. I'm Zach Jabal. Hope you're having a nice Wednesday. It's a lovely day here in Seattle. Sunny and relatively warm, and almost don't mind being inside, which is weird. But anyhow, we are going. Oh, and someone forgot to turn his phone off, which is faux pas number one of live streaming, but we're going to turn that ringer off right now so that there's no more of that. Anyhow, today we will be talking about Pinot Noir, and specifically the Montenor Estate Pinot Noir, the so-called red cap bottle. Can imagine you can all figure out why that is. And this is, I think, a really great example of a way to understand Oregon and Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. Producer that's been doing it for quite a while and has a really consistent approach, I think, and produces really kind of, and I mean this in a positive way, very kind of straightforward expressions of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. They do make some reserve wines, but I think I love about this is, like I said, it's a really kind of accessible look at Oregon Pinot Noir. It's usually less than $20 on a store shelf, which is nice, and that's a little bit rare for Pinot Noir generally, and Oregon Pinot Noir in particular. And so, yeah, let's talk a little bit with Pinot Noir as a grape itself. So Pinot Noir, like a lot of things, traces its origins back to France, to Burgundy in particular, which makes sense given that that's also the place that it's most famously grown. Best estimates are that it's been growing in Burgundy for at least 2,000 years. So obviously a long history. And it's interesting that they're still growing it despite the fact that growing Pinot Noir kind of sucks. And the reason they're doing that is because people also generally really like Pinot Noir, at least most people. And some of the reasons it's difficult to grow, it is an early budding grape, meaning that in places like Burgundy, where there's high risk of frost, it can be very susceptible to that if there's a late frost, so a frost in the early part of the growing season, or in the late part of the growing season, to be fair. Although it does ripen fairly early, so it's usually not as big a risk there. It's also a thin-skinned variety, and it's just really prone to lots of different diseases: rot, fungal diseases, diseases that affect the vine itself, and that makes it difficult to grow. That said, the resulting wines tend to be considered among the finest in the world, so people deal. And sometimes they deal by charging a lot of money for their wine. It's also probably the variety with the largest number of reasonably well-known clones. And so clones are a little harder to find in wine terms, but if we think of varieties as being sort of distinct in terms of having the characteristics that we understand, like Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, etc. Within each of those broader groups, there are then differences within each sort of variety that are referred to as clones. And like I said, Pinot Noir has probably the largest number of reasonably well-known. And for the sake of Oregon, which is what we'll mostly be focusing on today, there are sort of three groups of clones that are good to know. Dijon clones, which come from largely the vineyards around the town of Dijon in Burgundy. Pommard clones, which come from around the town of Pommard, also in Burgundy. And then Wädenswil, which is actually a Swiss clone. And these three are planted in the Willamette Valley in differing locations and differing quantities, but all three are reasonably important in understanding the valley. The Dijon clones are prized largely for their complexity. Pommard more for fruit and color, as well as a little bit of a spicy note, and then Wädenswil for sort of perfumey, aromatic notes. There's some other famous clones here in the U.S., the Martini clones, Swan clones, and Mount Eden clones, all in California. But Oregon has its own kind of suite of clones, and they're talked about a lot there. And the clone usually is like something like Dijon 115 or something. Like it'll have a number appended to it, which basically just refers to the specific clonal material, whatever. This is more than you need to know. As far as winemaking goes, when we talk about Pinot Noir, so it's prized and beloved because it, among varieties, is perhaps the best capable of expressing specific growing conditions, so specific vineyard conditions, specific vintage conditions, and it's hard to sort of say why exactly that is, other than that it is grown in a lot of different places, and the differences in the way those wines taste has something to do with the people making them, but a lot of it with the conditions under which it grows. That said, the flip side is it's, like I mentioned, very difficult to grow and also difficult to make wine from. The grapes themselves are fragile. There's not a lot of color. You have to be very meticulous in your winemaking. There's a lot of not intervention, but a lot of technique that's needed to produce great wine. At its best, I think Pinot Noir can be, the wines can be sort of perfumed. They can be obviously very complex. They can have a sort of a long finish despite not being all that full bodied. They can have a really nice balance of sort of fruit character, earth character, and then sort of spice and herbal character. At the worst, though, they can be thin, tart, unpleasant, sort of just kind of not very fun to drink wines. And in my humble opinion, I've had some that have been presented to me as great wines that are more on that side of things, and I don't like them very much. That's not to say that I like my Pinot Noir super fruit forward, but I think that fruit character is an important element of Pinot Noir and of most wines in general. So let's talk about what's in the glass here. So as I mentioned, I have a glass here of the 2017 vintage of the Montanore Estate Pinot Noir. And so this is actually, like I said, I think a really great introduction to a lot of what the Willamette Valley does well. So on the nose, we're definitely going to get some red fruit notes. I think a lot of more tart fruit, so tart red cherry, raspberry, even kind of a hint of cranberry. If you're drinking a different Oregon Pinot Noir from perhaps a different vintage or different producer, you might also be getting some riper red fruits, maybe even a little bit of like a really ripe cherry character, even black cherry. Again, if some of the warmer vintages, like if you have a 15 or 16, and I'll get into vintages in Oregon in a little bit. There's also a real note here of something that's very common in, I think, in a lot of Oregon Pinot Noir, which is kind of this hint of like cola nut. So if you think about what kind of traditionally is given something like Coca-Cola its flavor, among a lot of other things, and obviously it's now synthetic, but originally it was cola nut, and it has that kind of vaguely kind of nutmeg, but it's not as sweet smelling to me. And then also a real hint here of sort of a leafy, like a wet leaf kind of note, like like if you are in the Pacific Northwest, the sort of the smell of a Pacific Northwest, sort of that like wet leaf character that you get in the spring and fall, in particular. And then as far as that compares to sort of Pinot Noir more broadly, all of that's really classic. You can also find more sort of assertive red fruit character in some other places like California. You often get a really pronounced kind of strawberry note. And Pinot's kind of hard to generalize because the other thing that's really difficult to say is you can find winemakers who are using no new oak barrels in their winemaking like this. You can also find producers who are using 100% new oak in their wines and everything in between. And that oak interacting with the fruit character and those other spice notes can really change the profile of the wine quite a bit. So that's something to be aware of, depending on your own personal preference. Moving on to the Willamette Valley, which, as I mentioned, where this wine is from. So the Willamette, for those of you who are not from the Pacific Northwest or not familiar, is sort of at the northeast is bordered by Portland, and to the south is bordered by the city of Salem. And most of the vineyards are in the northern portion of that valley, closer to Portland than they are to Salem. And it's really interesting. The Willamette Valley has some distinct similarities to Burgundy, in that it has relatively, it has hills that or slopes, but not super steep and not super high. I mean, Burgundy has hills as it's famous for, but they're not large, relatively speaking. But one of the principal differences of the two that's different about the Willamette Valley as compared to Burgundy is the Willamette is actually relatively close to the Pacific Ocean and is definitely influenced by it. It's sort of between the coastal range and the Cascades, whereas, say, here in Washington, where the vast majority of our vineyards are east of the Cascade Mountains, which really act as a huge rain shadow and weather break, meaning that Washington vineyards are largely very, very dry and hot, and Willamette Valley vineyards, on the other hand, are relatively cool and wet, more like what you imagine the weather being in Portland or Seattle. And that makes sense. It's west of Portland. The other important thing to note is that there are several breaks in the much lower coastal range, which sort of funnel cool air and moisture in from the Pacific into the Willamette Valley throughout the year, but especially during the growing season. So one thing that happens in the Willamette that really rarely happens in Burgundy is you do sometimes get rain during the growing season, and especially even in the middle of the year, as opposed to Burgundy, where rainfall during the summer is very, very unlikely. It happens, but Burgundy is pretty continental, as in far from any large body of water, and so its weather patterns are a little more predictable in that specific way in terms of when the rainfall comes. Burgundy's weather is unpredictable in many other ways, which sucks for them, but that is one area where it's relatively consistent. Also, that all that moisture moving in from the Pacific means that you get a lot of clouds during the growing season. So the Willamette is actually relatively shady a lot of the year, not in the height of summer where you get a lot of a lot of sunlight exposure, but you can get noticeable cloud cover even in July and August occasionally. And certainly in any other month, you're likely to get some cloudy days, if not rainy days in there. That cloud cover is actually really important for Pinot Noir because, as I mentioned before, it's a thin-skinned variety. And that means it's also prone to essentially sunburn. I mean, it's silly because we think of that as a thing that happens to people, but it really does happen to grapes as well. And Pinot Noir is particularly susceptible to that. So having that additional sort of insurance policy of relatively frequent cloud cover helps protect the grapes, although a lot is done in the vineyard to protect them as well in terms of arranging the canopy of leaves to shade the grapes, especially in the hot heat of the day and in the sort of most intense sun. It's also important to note that you'll probably, if you're looking at a lot of bottles of Pinot Noir from Oregon, so this one that I have here, as I mentioned, and if you can see that there, this just says Willamette Valley, which is the largest appellation that kind of contains the whole set of the whole of the growing area that's mostly dedicated to Pinot Noir. But there are a number of sub-appellations within the Willamette Valley that you might see on a bottle. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about all of these, but I did want to just mention them in terms of kind of giving you some understanding. So the first area that was planted are what's called the Dundee Hills. A lot of the longest standing producers in the state are located there or have vineyards there. And the Dundee Hills are prized in large part because they have a specific kind of soil called Jory, spelled Jory, that's essentially a form of decomposed volcanic soil. So it's very red, it's iron rich, and it drains really well. And so I don't want to get into a whole grape growing thing here, but especially in areas like the Willamette where it rains a lot, it's important to understand that soils that drain well are going to be prized because they will kind of pull that water will drain away if it does rain during the growing season before too much of it is taken up by the vines. And the reason you want that is, especially close to the end of the growing season, if the vines take up too much water, they will the berries will swell, which means that for one, they can break and actually burst, which is obviously very bad. You can't then make wine. And even if they don't do that, you end up with essentially watered down wine. You end up with a larger volume of juice, but with no more additional sort of flavor compounds. So the wines are often a little bit too thin. And actually 17 is a really great example of a vintage where there was some rainfall late in the season. 2013, another one in particular, that 13 was noteworthy for that. Where you had producers, there was kind of a week of just serious downpour. And so producers who had picked already weren't so bothered by that. Some people who could afford to wait for the weather to warm back up and for that to dry out were okay. But some people definitely picked during or kind of right after those rainfalls, and they made some unfortunately pretty thin, watery wines. The other major influence in a lot of other sub-AVA is not so much in the Dundee Hills, but in places like the Amity Hills, the Van Duzer Corridor, and to some extent in the Chehalem Mountains, is wind. And so I mentioned already that there are these gaps in the coastal range, and obviously small gaps in a mountain range are going to produce a lot of wind airflow. And so wind is hugely important in some of these AVAs because when the grapes are subjected to a lot of airflow, a lot of wind. For one, it's good for them because it helps kind of keep rot issues in check. It blows off. I've talked about this in a few other appellations. It blows off a lot of the pests that would essentially cause rot on the vine or on the grapes. But it also, the grapes themselves produce thicker skins to essentially withstand the wind. And so as a result, the wines that come from those AVAs tend to be a little bit more robust. They tend to have a little more tannin and sometimes a little bit darker fruit profile. Not always. That's a little more vintage and site dependent. Other things to take note of in the Willamette specifically. So as I mentioned, there's this volcanic soil, mostly called Jory, but there are other forms of volcanic soil there. There's also some like wind-blown loess and loam, and then alluvial deposits, both from the Willamette River, and also the Missoula floods, which whenever we get around to a Washington appellation, I'm sure I'll talk much more about. Last note on the Willamette itself, or the sort of the growing conditions there. Kind of the two things that you would want to know. One is that because of the relative high level of precipitation and the presence of the Willamette River that cuts through the valley, it's a really fertile growing area. And if you go visit the Willamette, you'll find that the valley floor is really dedicated to things besides grapes. You have to kind of go up the hills a little bit generally to find vineyards. And that's because actually I should have probably made a note of this, but there is a minimum elevation for vineyards in the Willamette Valley because too low down and the soil is too fertile, and soil that's too fertile for, if it's too fertile, then again, you end up with sort of these not very interesting wines. We'll someday talk about sort of how grapevines need a certain amount of stress to produce great wines. And that's kind of a universal truth no matter where you are. And then the other thing going on in the Willamette is, of course, there is some amount of population pressure from Portland in particular. As Portland grows and expands, you're starting to see a little bit of encroachment of development into this agricultural land. Fortunately, wine production in particular is prized enough that it's not necessarily the case yet that vineyard land is more valuable for something else than for growing grapes. But there is some concern in the valley about sort of keeping the pastoral agricultural qualities that are there and trying to resist the sprawl that happens when any city grows and is happening with Portland to some extent. Okay, so I mentioned a bit ago that vintage really makes a difference here. It makes a difference with Pinot Noir in general, and it certainly makes a difference in the Willamette Valley, where growing conditions can be hugely different from year to year. I'm not going to go through every last vintage in Oregon. I'm really going to just talk about the last decade because for most of us, that's really all we would likely to be drinking. If you find an older Pinot Noir from the Willamette, you're welcome to take your chances. Some Pinot Noir can certainly age for a while and some of the wines from really good producers from great vintages can do well for 15, 20 years. But for the most part, I don't like to go past about 15 years with my Oregon Pinot Noir or really Pinot Noir in general. So 2010 and 2011 were both quite cool vintages. 2011 even cooler than 2010. And I should have gotten into this before. When I talk about vintages here, I want to be clear that with few exceptions, I'm not really trying to say better or worse. I think that's a much more about your own personal style and in terms of what you like in wine, and to some extent about, quality vineyard and quality winemaker will generally be able to make great wine, or at least good wine in any vintage with very few exceptions. And as our understanding of how to handle different conditions evolves and develops, I find that more and more to be the case, that vintages that would be described in past decades as bad are just different, and you may or may not appreciate those differences. So cooler vintages, in other words, less heat, less sun during the growing season, tend to produce wines that are less fruit driven, and the fruit that you do find tends to be more tart. This makes probably a lot of intuitive sense. You can often find more overt earthy or even green notes in the wine. If you find that hint of sort of green that I find in this Montanor, like a little bit of a tomato leaf character, to be unpleasant, then these might be vintages to avoid. If you like kind of more full-bodied wines, these tend to be less tannic and less full-bodied. They tend to be more delicate. But I do find that while they may be a little bit less approachable in their youth, they tend to be more aromatic in the long run. And I find that these vintages tend to age better if you do like to age your Pinot Noir. Conversely, if you don't, then you may find that warmer vintages are more your style. They tend to produce more fruit and just riper fruit profile on the palate. That's when we might start getting into that black cherry note that I mentioned at the beginning. You'll also find, I think, more notes of things like licorice, sort of a kirsch or like brandied cherry note, even jam. I think these wines can be super delicious when they're young. They don't always hold together as well with age, as that really kind of overt fruit note starts to diminish or sort of integrate into the wine. I think that they often lack structure. They tend to be more kind of fruit driven and in your face and bold. And that, like I said, can be super delicious. It's just, they may not age as well. And often those are the wines that get the most acclaim at the outset because they taste really good right away. And sometimes they hold up and just sometimes they don't. So anyhow, back to the actual vintages that we've had. So 2010 and 2011 were both quite cool. 2011 being the coldest vintage on record in a long time in the Willamette Valley. And that was true actually in Washington as well. Those two vintages were very similar in Washington and Oregon, despite, like I said, the sort of geographic differences. 2012 is generally considered a really well-balanced vintage. It was warm but not hot, and very consistent throughout the growing season, which with something like Pinot Noir, grape growers especially love because it means that they can be only sort of paranoid instead of totally paranoid about what's going to happen to their grapes. 2013, as I mentioned, was kind of a warmer vintage and then had this huge rain event right around the harvest time for a lot of people. And so there's a case where you really need to kind of know the producer, taste the wine if you can, or just take a chance. And then 14, 15, and 16, hotter, hottest. It was this continuation of a trend that we've obviously seen and continue to see of just warmer vintages. Everything starting earlier, bud break being earlier, ripening being earlier, harvest being earlier. The wines are bold. I haven't had, obviously we're only, 6 years, it's not even 6 years in from the youngest of these, or from the oldest of these wines. So I can't yet say definitively how they age. I have my doubts. I would say that 2016 in particular for me is a vintage where, unless I really trust the producer, those aren't wines I tend to like. I tend to stay away from them. I think just, it was so hard for even producers who really wanted to restrain the ripeness of the grapes. It just was so hot and so unrelentingly hot that there wasn't a lot they could do about it. Now, 17 and 18 are both really odd vintages. 17 started out cool and wet and then had heat later in the growing season. 17 and 18 were both affected by smoke from wildfires in the Columbia Gorge and in other parts of the Pacific Northwest. Again, I haven't had a lot of wines that I've seen really obvious issues with smoke taint on as of yet. More issues in the Columbia Gorge wines than in Willamette Valley wines. But the smoke did help kind of keep sunlight levels down a little bit, which delayed ripening in both 17 and 18. And with 18 is really interesting because you had a sort of hot vintage, but again, with sort of really different conditions in a few different parts of the valley. So 17 and especially 18 are another couple where you probably want to know your producer. And speaking of, let's talk a little bit about the people who actually make this wine. So again, just for those of you who didn't catch it, 2017 Montanore Estate Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. Montanore is centered around a 200-acre vineyard that was planted in 1982 in sort of the northern part of the Willamette Valley. It's the vineyard. That vineyard itself is all biodynamic, and we're going to spend just a moment on what biodynamic is. So biodynamic, the best sort of pithy explanation I've heard is that it's about viewing the farm or vineyard in this case as a sort of holistic organism, and that really, if you're only thinking about one crop, you're not really taking a holistic total view of everything. So the idea is that you're growing kind of all of these different components, not just grapes, but you're growing cover crop. You're growing things to plant near the grapes to attract things that would prey on potential pests for the grapes. It's this kind of, again, holistic is really the best explanation that the best word for it. It definitely has its sort of mystical side. There's a lot of parts. There's these various sort of preparations and tinctures that are made up and spread on the vineyard. There are a lot of adherence to lunar cycles. I'm not an expert, and so I can't go into that. You can Google it if you're curious. But the reasons that I do think it's something that's worth noting, for one, they do it, but also I think it's worth at least paying some attention to. And I think because it does two things that are really important. One, it really truly promotes the health of the vineyard in a way that I think is just more sustainable. And you don't even have to care about sustainability as sort of a global practice to think about how important it is that vineyards be sustainable if you like wine. And it's especially relevant because winemaking got really, like all forms of agriculture, got really affected by a lot of the sort of move towards chemical interventions, be they fertilizers, pesticides, et cetera, in the middle part of the 20th century. And biodynamics was originated before that, but has been adopted in large part as a pushback against that. And also because I think it promotes a general sense of stewardship of the land. And again, winemaking is, I think, fortunately in many ways, a relatively non-intensive form of agriculture. Vines are really hardy. It takes a lot less water. It doesn't take, generally speaking, especially if you're doing biodynamic practices, you don't need to buy commercial fertilizers, things like that. But we're still, working the land, using the land, and it's important, I think, to recognize that producers who are thoughtful about how they do that. I like to try and support those producers when and where I can. So the Montanor, this wine, the Red Cap, is actually a blend of estate fruit and then some purchased fruit from around the Willamette Valley. But the estate vineyard itself is largely dedicated to Pinot Noir, but the current owner, the Marchesi family, traces their heritage back to northern Italy, and so they grow a number of other varieties that are native to northern Italy, or that grow in northern Italy, including actually Pinot Noir is pretty prevalent in certain parts of northern Italy, but they grow kind of fun grapes like Teral de Go and Lagrein and some others that I am currently blanking on. There are just a couple more things I wanted to get to, but I did want to see if anyone's got any questions or anything about this wine or thoughts about what you've been tasting. If you got a couple more minutes before I wrap things up here, feel free to share them. The last thing I want to talk about is kind of pairing and application. So Pinot Noir is great because I think it's an extremely versatile food wine. It does great with sort of light meats. It's also, for those of us in the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, Pinot has often been considered a really great pairing with salmon. I like it especially with like a grilled or some sort of preparation of salmon where you're getting a little bit of a smoky note, but it works well with pan-seared or even broiled or something like that. I also find that it works really beautifully with mushrooms. Again, there's kind of a mushroomy, earthy quality to the wine. So Pinot Noir and mushrooms is a really classic combination. I don't love it with red meat. I think it can work really well in some cases with a little leaner red meat. There's not a lot of tannin in here, so you can't necessarily pair this with like a big, to me at least, with like a big steak or something. But maybe, lamb, maybe something like a really lean cut of beef, or even something like, like a duck confit or something like that, could work really well. The other possible pairing on the sort of vegetable side, I actually also really like Pinot Noir with certain kinds of like nuts. So like hazelnuts or even walnuts, things like that can go really nicely as well. There's not really a nuttiness in the wine, but something about that sort of tart fruit character, that kind of red cherry cranberry note, I think works really well with nuts, I should say. All right. Well, that's going to about do it for me. I hope all of you are enjoying yourselves on this Wednesday evening. I have most of the rest of a bottle of wine to drink, although I do have some help. I will see you all back here on Saturday. We will be doing Tempranillo from Spain, for those of you who are excited about that. I have some old Rioja that I will be drinking. You can search out similarly aged expressions of Rioja, which can be really fun to drink. But whatever you want to find that's Tempranillo based will be just fine as well. And like I said, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you back here on Saturday.